the reason the rich and the powerful maintain their power is denying us knowledge of our own past. They have buried the American system precisely because it is a powerful tool to mobilize the population. Now, I will bring up Webster Tarpley, PhD. He is an historian, and I see many of you have his book, Surviving the Cataclysm. He is the host of the weekly broadcast World Crisis Radio. You can follow Webster's work at tarpley.net. We also have a lot of addresses. You can find our political party that runs elections at taxwallstreetparty.org, and you can find our think tank, the United Front Against Austerity, at againstausterity.org. So here is Dr. Webster Tarpley. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I want to welcome all of you. Thank Daniela for her warm introduction. Now, we have our work cut out for us. This is an intensive course. It's a kind of total immersion. We called it Econothon. And the Econothon is an attempt to cram one 3 or 4 credit course into one weekend. And this has been done. It is done. I'll show you some examples. About a year ago, I took part in something like this for a group of Germans in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And they were people who were fleeing from Europe, as some do, and they wanted an orientation. So it can be done, but it's 3 hours of course today. It's 2 hours of my spiel, 1 hour from you. And tomorrow it's 2, 2, and 2 from me, followed by 1, 1, and 1 from you. And if you don't speak up, it's going to become unbearable for you. Not for me, but for you. My job goes ahead, right? As I always say, if you're an orator, you better be a tank and just go forward. So our approach is, therefore, that we have 1 hour of discussion built in. And I hope everybody's going to take active part in that. The title, as you see, The Political Economy of the American System. I will at some point tell you the history of this course. I have given this course quite a number of times, starting about 1970 or 1971. As a result of this course, political organizations, in particular something called the Italian Labor Party, Partito Operaio Europeo, were created in the early 1970s. So it's a class that aims to recruit people to a movement. Certainly, it does that. It makes no bones about it. But not as foot soldiers, as leaders. We don't have any room at this point for the good soldier Schweik, right? We need people who are willing to take part as leaders. So, here we go. Friday evening. Saturday, practically 10 to 10. There are a couple of breaks built in, right? There's a break after the first one for 1 hour. After the second one, there's 2 hours. And then it goes all the way to 10 o'clock tomorrow. Sunday, we assume you're going to have brunch. So we go from 11 to 5. It's about a 15-minute coffee break in between. You might get a college education in a single weekend. I sure hope so. The method here, and you'll see that it's rooted in a specific psychological approach, is rather than going through this pedestrian and painful, long, weary process of digging yourself up and clawing yourself up from the bottom, why not come in sweeping and just assimilate the whole thing from the top down in the time it takes to snap your fingers? And of course, you can do that provided you're willing to do several years of preparatory work. So the idea is learn subjects from the top down and avoid years and years of effort to assimilate the obscurantist minutiae, right, which are only of interest to academics anyway. I flatter myself some people can attain genius. Just about anybody can be a genius, but, of course, genius is work. So once again, this is a process of striving for it. Some people can become mass leaders. That's our greatest hope. Virtually everybody can benefit. Now, for the understanding of this that I have, the principal prerequisite is a desire to overthrow and replace the imperialist finance bourgeoisie. That is to say, Wall Street, the financier oligarchy. That is a ruling class that we can no longer tolerate. They are simply incompetent, and the future of civilization looks very grim if they're allowed to keep up with their shenanigans. If some of this has scared you so far, if you say, well, I don't really have much formal education, I'm not versed in all this stuff, that can become an advantage. It's probably easier to learn some of these topics, economics especially, from the top down, if you've never learned it. Because if you think you know it, that becomes the biggest obstacle, because it is a thoroughly corrupt discipline. So you don't need to unlearn the mystifications pervade by the quackademics. The quackademics being my funny word for the professors, right? Die professoralen Fachidioten, as they used to say, right? That was the old German student movement. So what's the starting point? We've had 25 years of globalization, and humanity is in agony. It's not clear whether the deaths every day from starvation, malnutrition, diarrhea, other diseases that can be cured for 25, 50 cents are 40,000 or 50,000, but that's the ballpark. 50,000 people a day across the world die from underdevelopment, lack of clean water, lack of elementary immunizations, and all the rest. We're also witnessing the collapse of governments and societies into failed states, chaos, and warlordism. And you'll say, yeah, Tarpley, the CIA does that stuff. Yes, but the only way they can do that is with the prerequisite, the conditions created by the economic breakdown crisis. We've always got the threat of pandemics, right? We had a close brush with a pandemic. We'll have more. By the way, these slideshows will be somehow available, right? They'll be built into the film. And for a slight consideration, you can even get the original slideshow from yours truly. So certainly you can take notes, but don't feel like you have to write down everything, because you'll get this. Just today, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has set the doomsday clock 2 minutes closer to the end of the world. They've gone from 5 minutes to midnight to 2 minutes to midnight. So, or is it 2 minutes to 3 minutes to midnight. So we've gotten 2 minutes closer to the apocalypse. And they cite a number of things, but I think major war, right? The crisis with Russia by itself would be enough. And then there's always this question of the Chinese adventurism in regard to small islands in the South China Sea and similar places. The economic breakdown crisis is worsening. By the time you leave this classroom, I hope that you'll know enough economics to know that deflation is not a question of the Super Bowl and sports, but it's a severe economic problem. Now, you're supposed to laugh at that. Have you not been following? That was a gag line. Have you not followed this thing about Deflategate and the footballs? And they say the New England Patriots are accused of deflation. Then all the libertarians love them. And we've got lunatics talking about civil war, right? Glenn Beck talks about civil war. Michael Savage talks about civil war. You know, we are here on a battlefield of the U.S. Civil War. This is where the Confederates under Early came down 355, the Georgia Avenue out here, and they were stopped at Fort Stevens, which is about a mile away. And that's where Abraham Lincoln came out and got shot at. And Oliver Wendell Holmes said to him, "Get down, you fool," because he didn't want to see him get killed. If maybe tomorrow in the break we can, if you have any Civil War buffs here, we'll organize a little excursion just to go down there and take a look at it. All right. And in the center of this, right, so you say, where do we come in? There's a world crisis of the ruling oligarchy. Now, in the course of human society, we've had all sorts of ruling classes, right? We've had societies ruled by priests, by generals, by bureaucrats, by demagogues, but the one we have is ruled by bankers, okay? This is an oligarchy, plutocracy, ruled by bankers. And as Plato, one of our big strong points in these lectures, we're coming at you from Plato, right? This is Plato here we're attempting. So the evils of plutocracy, right? He says, oligarchy is a constitution filled with many evils where the rich rule and the poor people have no say. That is the reality. But we've also got our friends, the left liberal mushheads that are all over us, right? They dominate the scene, right? From Amy Goodman to Michael Moore, you know, the drill, Noam Chomsky, all the rest of them. Their ultimate belief is that the bankers should rule. If you get one of these people to be honest, they will say, well, bankers are going to be better than priests, generals, bureaucrats, demagogues. Bankers are going to be better, right? They'll say Soros is better than some general. Well, we would say to those left liberal mushheads, what about you? If not you, who? And if not now, when? Right? That was the old slogan in the student movement. Also notice that the mushheads believe there's no such thing as right and wrong, so you got to essentially take what you can get. Now, then we have our other friends, the libertarians. And the problem with the libertarians is they demand austerity. It's a kind of austerity which has been historically shown to destroy the political and economic system of the countries where it's imposed. I'm thinking especially of Chancellor Brüning in Germany between 1930 and 1932. What made Germany ripe for Hitler was 2 years of savage austerity, on the whole quite similar to what Ron Paul was proposing in his last presidential campaign. So these libertarians ultimately destroy the safeguards economically, politically, and make bankers' rule inevitable. So the conclusion is, in the good Plato sense, the world needs philosopher leaders. And of course he says, philosopher kings and philosopher queens. And this is quite an achievement for Plato in the times in which he lived, to realize that women were emphatically included. So what we need, though, is philosophers to be influential in society. And this is my appeal to you. Don't you want to be part of this? Now, I want to compliment you on your good sense to come here rather than to Davos, Switzerland. And here's where you have the financier oligarchs and all their creatures, right? Meeting on the Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann's famous book. Of course, in those days it was a tuberculosis sanitarium. Today, it's for those who are disturbed, committed to improving the state of the world. Or, if you didn't go to that one, there's another one, and that is the Koch brothers retreat. The Koch brothers are gathering in Palm Springs, California, and if you want to run for office, they'll vet you. So don't go there. Now, in order to make my talk a little bit more concrete, I say the ruling class has struck out, okay? I say if you let them stay in power, it's going to be bad. So what's the answer? We got to start thinking about replacing the ruling class, but I got to make my case. David Rockefeller, still alive, under normal circumstances, he should have taken over from John J. McCloy and McGeorge Bundy as the spokesperson of the Eastern banking establishment. That is to say, the U.S. system, we've had Colonel Henry Stimson. We've had John J. McCloy, one of his protégés, McGeorge Bundy, one of his protégés. When Bundy didn't want to do it anymore, it seemed to be the time for David Rockefeller to step forward and take over as the spokesperson. Not the dictator, but the spokesperson. And he couldn't do it. He was too stupid. It was all gone. They said he was too dumb to balance his own checkbook. And he's was the head of Chase Manhattan, J.P. Morgan Chase. Now he's been replaced by Jamie Dimon, running J.P. Morgan Chase. And of course, this is one of the people who brought down all the zombie banks. I guess we can call him the classic zombie banker. And all he could think of in most recent outing was to make phone calls to people and tell them that people in Congress, and tell them that they had to vote to use Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation money to insure his derivative speculation, right? He's also responsible for the London whale. You know that one? $7-8 billion in losses. Unbelievable. He's incompetent. Looks like he spends all of his time in a tanning bed. Now, of course, the infamous David Koch. His father was a great supporter of Mussolini, member of the John Birch Society, but also dealt with the Soviets, right? He was not averse to communist forced labor if he needed it. He's going to get Rubio, Cruz, Rand Paul, Walker to this gathering at Palm Springs, California this weekend. And the press coverage is, the Koch primary tests hopefuls for the GOP. Now, I submit to you, how long can such a system last? Not long, I say. On the other wing, this is a classic gang, counter-gang, Soros, George Soros, and his leading idea is that the U.S. population is not stupefied enough. They have to be more stupefied. And what you need is a massive infusion of marijuana, right? Marijuana dispensers in every school, third graders, whatever you want. And, of course, this is the left wing of the Democratic Party, the Socialist International, the International Trade Union Conference. You know the drill. How about this guy? I was going to, actually, maybe we can do a little guessing, right, if you want to liven things up. Tom Steyer, worth a modest $1.6 billion, is an environmentalist fanatic. This is now the left wing of the Democratic Party, worked at Goldman Sachs in risk arbitrage. That means gambling, under Rubin. And Rubin, of course, was one of the people who wrecked the Clinton administration from the inside. And, of course, what he does, he takes advantage of Citizens United. He spent $74 million on the last Senate election, right, 2012. But unfortunately for him, none of his candidates succeeded. Oop. Hang on. Oop. Now, how about... Oop. Who's that?
Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch. Okay. This a figure of the British Empire. Okay? So from Australia to Britain to the United States, tabloids, Fox News, reactionary, tending towards fascism on any number of points. But he counts as a member of the Anglo-American ruling class, like the rest of these people that I'm showing you. Here's an interesting one. Who's that? Current events quiz. Never a dull moment. This is probably the World Economic Forum last year. You can read his thing. What do we got? Henry Kravis. Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. This is your basic junk bond assisted hostile takeover of the 1980s. Bought RJR Nabisco, $27 billion, and wrote the biggest check in world history up to that point, $28 billion, from Kohlberg Kravis Roberts to RJR Nabisco. But he has a political dimension. Anybody know what his political dimension is? Yes. And what does he do for Petraeus?
He floats his bills. He pays his bills.
Yeah, there you go. He is the financial angel for General David Petraeus, right? The principal focus of Bonapartism, that is, to turn the United States into a military dictatorship, however veiled or however hoped up. He's the one who's behind that, right? So he's, what can we say, as Krupp was to Hitler, Kravis is to Petraeus. Is that too much? No, I think that's probably understated. So that's him. And, of course, this junk bond-assisted hostile takeover, we have to talk about this. Petraeus, of course. I'm secretly trying to gauge the level of how au fait you all are, because I don't know. So that's Petraeus, obviously. His friend Allen was just indicted. I'm sorry, he is now threatened with indictment. He's threatened with indictment. We want him indicted, and we want his friend Allen indicted too. Right? Allen being the ISIS czar. A young Henry Kissinger. Back when the world was young, and Henry Kissinger, right, he said, power is the greatest aphrodisiac. There he is. Now here I have another one. I'll give you a hint. Peter Thiel. What's his ruling passion? There are two.
Vulture capitalism.
Yeah, but what does he do? Two things that he does. Yeah, the seasteading. In other words, remember in the 1930s there used to be gambling ships, right? And people would go out there and that would become Las Vegas, off the port of New York. So he wants to have places where there's no law, right? Where they can do anything. And of course for him anything really means anything. And the other thing is he doesn't want you to go to college. Don't go to college, says Peter Thiel. He'll even pay you. Your parents can sacrifice for 20 years to get you into college, and he'll come along and give you more money to make you quit. Zbigniew Brzezinski. Here, this is the Wehrkunde conference. That's coming up now in about a month, right? That's another one you don't want to go to. So look, the problem that we have, the weakness of leadership, right, the void of leadership here in the United States, is that the last real president was Franklin D. Roosevelt with his 4 terms and his control of the Federal Reserve. He dictated to the Federal Reserve what they would do. And after that, the U.S. financier oligarchy said, hey, this is an oligarchy. Never again a real president. Because under the Constitution, if you have a strong personality, the president can very well break the power. He can check the power of the oligarch. Now, we've had a series of puppet presidents. And as you go through this, right, this is political economy. So we're looking at the political preconditions for programmatic political action. The biggest mistake you can make in political analysis is to assume that a modern U.S. president is automatically running the government in command. That's a fallacy. That's the most ridiculous assumption you can make. It's much better to assume the opposite, that he's a powerless figurehead, like a ceremonial president, right, on the German or Italian model, where the president has no power. If you're a president, that's just the beginning. You then have to fight for and win power, and most of them never do it. Now, we're going to attempt a tour de force here as usual. Hopefully not a tour de farce, but here we go. We're going to try to go through the various post-war presidents and just show how the oligarchy used them. Here we have, of course, Truman. If you want to help me along, right? It's good. Harry S. Truman, member of the Ku Klux Klan, official of the Pendergast machine in Missouri. Pendergast was indicted, put in jail. He knew that he could be indicted and be put in jail too. He was chosen to get Henry Wallace off the ticket. Wallace was the one who wanted to avoid the Cold War. Don't want to deify him, but that's certainly true about Henry Wallace. This is the guy who started the Cold War in the service of Sir Winston Churchill and the Churchill family. And this was not necessary. There was no need to have the Cold War at this point. But he was a rather pathetic little puppet. He was subject to transports of rage. He would lose his temper and rave. And also, he was a pedant. If you read his letters, he says, this is the biggest thing since Hercules and Agamemnon and Henry VIII. And he goes and he throws all this stuff out. He tries to make a parade of knowledge, which he really doesn't have. Now, who controlled him? I start with him because this is very well documented. On internal policy, we have Clark Clifford, later a power in the Democratic Party. There was a meeting, and Clark Clifford writes about this in his memoirs. There was a meeting at least once a week of the people who ran Truman. Truman never realized that there was a meeting going on, but Clark Clifford was the chairman of that meeting. Foreign policy, it's Dean Acheson. And actually, Dean Acheson mediates the influence of somebody I should have added, W. Averill Harriman of the Harriman banking house, right? Envoy by Roosevelt to Churchill, to Stalin, to the Marshall Plan, and so forth. So the outcome of this is the wrecking of the New Deal, Roosevelt foreign policy, he would send troops to attack the base of the Democratic Party, right? He would send troops to attack striking steel workers, coal miners, and all the rest. Who do we have here? And? Dulles. Very good. Okay. So Eisenhower, not the worst person, but somewhat passive, a weak president in many ways. During World War II, he had been the chairman of the board. And the result of the chairman of the board, I don't have a map here, but if you think this is Europe, under his chairman of the board approach, you had Montgomery going up here into the Netherlands, and you had Patton going down here towards Czechoslovakia. There's a big hole in the middle, and Hitler decided to attack in the middle. And if there had been a few more tanks of gasoline available for Germany, this entire Allied invasion would have been thrown back to the coast of the Channel. I suppose the Soviets would have come through about a year later, but that would have been the end of that. In other words, as a general, really not so good. Now, this guy is already a monster of iniquity in the sense that he, according to some accounts, either he, John Foster Dulles, or his brother, Allen Dulles, were present at the meeting of German industrialists and bankers who decided put Hitler into power. In other words, he's got a piece of that. The Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, okay, implicated in supporting Hitler. Now, of course, Kennedy, the example that proves the rule, right? The case that proves the exception that proves the rule. Here he goes challenging the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Federal Reserve System, the Washington oligarchs, the Georgetown oligarchs, and on and on and on. And we know what the result was. And this was, of course, a conspiracy. What can we say? We can't avoid it just because this is somehow heretical. It's a conspiracy centered in the Central Intelligence Agency. It was essentially the plot, the Operation Mongoose, ostensibly to kill Castro, redirected against him. So there he is, assassinated in 1963. His plan had been to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces, and we should never forget that worthy goal. He was also obviously persecuted by J. Edgar Hoover. So here's somebody whose whole administration is a process of freeing himself from bankrupt crackpot advisors, be it Curtis LeMay or others, right? The so-called Executive Committee, or EXCOM, that tried to push him into World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he said no. Johnson, in many ways, one of the more interesting of these figures, right? Somewhat tragic. Domestically, one of the very best that we've had since Roosevelt, right? Medicare, Medicaid, a host of positive things. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But he was profiled, and this is this awful woman, Doris Kearns Goodwin, right? She was chosen to give the speech at Gettysburg, and the 150th anniversary of Gettysburg, and this, she bombed, right? This was widely resented because she didn't care about Gettysburg, Lincoln, Civil War, any of those issues, none of that. She's Doris Kearns Goodwin. She essentially became his confidant, and she writes in this book about how he would come to her room at night and want to talk to her. They would go back to his bedroom. She would get into his bed. He would sit there, and he would tell her, he would open up his soul to her. And basically his problem was a tremendous sense of inferiority, that he hadn't gone to the Harvard boutique. Can you imagine that? You're freaked out because you didn't go to Harvard? Harvard? What, are we nuts? So there he is. And it has to do with his relations with his mother and his father. And I recommend this book. It really is revealing, unless she's edited the stuff out. But here what you see, therefore, is the psychological weakness that is played upon by these people in order to secure obedience. Of course, Nixon. Sorry?
What do you think of Nelson's book, 2 books?
I don't know. You tell me.
Well, I think they're magnificent.
Who is the author? Tell us all the stuff. You got to be pedagogical here. We're trying.
Philip Nelson, he's written 2 books on Johnson. They're very, very thorough, and he sees him as a complete psychopath and a narcissist, and the one who actually was the man man behind organizing the whole assassination.
No. This I would rule out absolutely. In other words, this is precisely help. This is precisely what I would not go with. The problem is, as I've said, Johnson was a puppet. Johnson was not in a position to decide anything. He couldn't. I mean, he could decide what legislation to push, things like this. But the idea that he could say, I'm going to kill Kennedy, it's out of this world. It's about 99 pay grades above a puppet president. And this is what I'm trying to get at. All right? How could Johnson do it? Whoever wrote that is covering for the Central Intelligence Agency, Langley, Virginia. We have other books, right? We have Tom Hartman, the great progressive. He writes a book saying, oh, the CIA never killed Kennedy. It was the mafia. As soon as you see that run, I would recommend Joan Mellon, Mellen. I think in many ways she's the most balanced on this stuff, and she's the one who's got the CIA squarely in view. Now, of course, his problem also was tremendous impoverished family story. Brother died of tuberculosis, and also a Quaker. If you are a Quaker, you are an antinomian. It means that you think the law does not apply to the elect. And Quakers in particular have a theory, the early ones especially, the theory of the inner voice. We'll talk about inner voices later in the evening. Thing is, when you get an inner voice, you got to make sure who's at the other end of the line. Okay? Because in the terminology I'm going to try to teach in a minute, that could be a phone call from your preconscious or the Holy Spirit, or it could be from the id. And if it's from the id, you got to watch out, right? You know, don't take any tips on horses or stocks from the id. So he really believed that he could do whatever he wants, right? He has this famous quote, if the president does it, it's not illegal. That is a parody of the Roman jurist Ulpian, the famous quod principi placuit vigorum legis habet. In other words, whatever pleases the prince has the force of law. That's what he thought too. However, perhaps in contradiction to what you think you know about him, he was overthrown by the CIA. There is no doubt. And they didn't do it because of his abuses. They did it for other reasons, among them to permanently weaken the institution of the presidency. And that was done by these CIA characters that you see, by James McCord, by Howard Hunt, right? Some of the most famous CIA people of the era were all involved in Watergate. And, of course, Bob Woodward was from the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the various people who revealed the tapes were from the FBI. So here's an example of a president who couldn't understand what was happening to him. And also the Pentagon Papers, right? Daniel Ellsberg and so forth. And then Kissinger comes into his office. I got to do my Kissinger again. He says, Mr. President, your government is falling apart with all these leaks. We must create the plumbers. And that was the end of him. Jerry Ford, you know the quote about him from Johnson? That he was so stupid that he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. That was too much for him. Said Lyndon B. Johnson about Gerald Ford. So he's actually, his roots go precisely to that horrible part of Michigan that's giving the world so much trouble, right? The coast, the west coast of Michigan. He's a little bit further north. I think he's more like Grand Rapids than Benton Harbor and so forth. But that area out there seems to be quite problematic. And, of course, the bane of his existence was he had Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, so there were 2 or 3 assassination attempts, right? Sarah Jane Moore, Lynette Squeaky Fromm. Why that? Because if your Vice President is Nelson Rockefeller, it's better not to go outdoors. Now, Carter is a very extreme case, right? Carter is one of the most extreme cases. When he says he was born again, what he actually means is that he had a nervous breakdown in the time after his mother died and after he lost the governorship of Georgia in an election, right? He was defeated at the polls. He had a nervous breakdown, and that's where he gets the born again. If I just may go back, Nixon was looked at by the ruling elite to judge could he be allowed to become president. And originally they said no, he is too intact. But then when his mother died and he lost the election in California, he also had a nervous breakdown. And after that, he was considered qualified. In other words, at least one nervous breakdown is necessary so that they can play on whatever your complexes are. And you probably include Johnson in that too. Okay. Now, I was once traveling in Minnesota, Mayo Clinic, and picked up the local paper. This was it was right after his term ended, so it was 1989. And he was in town. Ronald Reagan was in town. He was in Rochester, Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic. What was happening with him? He was getting operated on for water on the brain, which is a very debilitating thing. So he went through significant parts of his presidency with Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and water on the brain. It's reported that in an audience with Pope John Paul II, he fell asleep. His method was to have these cards. Anyway, he'd have these cards. And he'd have a meeting with congressmen and say, "Good morning, Senator. How are you? Thanks for coming to the White House to visit me today." You see where I'm going. How long can a society survive when these sorts of people are put in? And, of course, the idea is that he's going to be a puppet, which most of the time he was. Now, we've now entered the area where it's easier to follow because they've been thoroughly exposed, as in this book, The Unauthorized Biography. He also, George Bush, the elder, had serious problems with his thyroid, right? This thyroid storm, right? He had rage explosions. He had all kinds of serious problems, hissing and so forth. Anyway, I commend your attention to this book, which has a significant description of it. He was so manic and frenetic that he didn't play golf the way most people do, where the thing to look out for is the golf score. With him, it was how fast could you do 18 holes? And he called it cart polo. So he'd come up in the cart, jump out, hit the ball, get back in the cart, drive off, and the goal was to finish it as fast as you could. Okay. Now, picking up a supermarket tabloid the other day, we hear about him as the horn dog in chief. The ruling elite looked at him and they said, we'll control him the same way we wanted to control Kennedy. In other words, they thought that Kennedy would be a playboy, sex maniac, and so forth. And they said, here's another sex maniac, right? He can't get through a day unless he's got some woman telling him how great he is, because he doesn't feel like he's very great at all, right? He feels like he's quite inferior. So, talented actor like Reagan, right? Reagan was really a nasty guy, but he was able to cover it up. When you look at him, Reagan as governor of California, he's really vicious. But he learned to go for this avuncular thing. In this case, it's the Southern populist, right, that people became familiar with. But abolished welfare. In other words, he destroyed one of the key provisions of the Social Security Act of 1935, aid to families with dependent children. 1999, Graham Leach Bliley wipes out Glass-Steagall, which in those days was a kind of protection. One of the things I'm going to argue is it's too late for Glass-Steagall. The derivatives are everywhere. That horse is out of the barn. You got to tax him. You got to outlaw him. Glass-Steagall won't do it. And then in 2000, the Commodity Exchange Modernization Act, I think it's called, that simply deregulates all derivatives. All derivatives are deregulated. And that leads you right to the crash of 2008. So he was ultimately controllable. In the case of Bush the Younger, the story, I guess, is dry drunk. Someone who is an alcoholic, remains an alcoholic, but has it under control at least sometimes, right? The famous scene where his wife says, you got to choose between Jack Daniels and me. So he also fits of rage. There's a whole book called Bush on the Couch. That's highly interesting. And generally speaking, controlled. Certainly controlled. Controlled through family tradition and so forth. also a very interesting pattern, had to have a group of adoring women around him, all women in the White House, right? Including one that he tried to put on the Supreme Court. Now, in the case of Obama, we have not one but two important sources. With Obama, it's too much in the face of all of us. I wish I'd shown you the back of this book. I've got a cartoon back there where you see Obama debating Hillary. And Hillary says, "Oh, I'm going to be a hawk. I'm going to attack Iran." And Obama says to her, "What? Attack Iran? You're crazy." And then Zbigniew Brzezinski comes out and grabs a hold of his ear, and Obama starts ranting, "We have to attack Russia." And lo and behold, look where we are now. It hasn't been a linear path, but under the Obama administration, with, I believe, significant input from Zbigniew Brzezinski and some others, we are now in the biggest crisis with Russia, and it was done on the basis of the postmodern coup, meaning the color revolution. So if you get this book, you've got a description of the color revolutions in quite a bit of detail. The Albert Einstein Institute, Colonel Robert Helvey, Gene Sharp, and all these people. And then this is the constellation of people around him, including Bernardine Dawn with her whip from SDS. Is anybody in SDS? Bill Ayers with his weatherman bomb, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the goddamn America pastor, and so forth. So, and indeed, the Democratic Party is pretty much, on the deck after losing, 70, 80 members of Congress under this guy? I mean, it really has happened. Now, of course, today, I have to add, today, there are people around Obama who want war much more than he does. So we don't go around attacking Obama because that's stupid. Got to attack Petraeus, got to attack Allen, Kerry, Samantha Power, Susan Rice, right? Those are the people you really got to watch out for. So in some ways, Obama's a lesser evil. But then if we look at the entirety of this administration from a historical point of view, it's a disaster, right? It's horrendous. Now, the future smiles at us. This charming lady, a monument to mediocrity, Jeb Bush, continuing that saga of decline and degeneracy. And, of course, he's a reactionary. And then, of course, Romney and the Mormon machine, right? They're not giving up. That Mormon machine just won't quit. Because he has prophecies to act out, right? He has the prophecy of vengeance against the United States for killing Joseph Smith, and the White Horse prophecy, which is that the Mormons take over the United States and then have the final showdown with Russia. So, polygamy, theocracy, and subversion. Is that the future you want? And then the clown car. Little Rand, we call him the senator from Aquabuda. Aquabuda being this, at Baylor University, I think, it's some Freemasonic gang, and he molested some woman telling her she had to bow down to Aquabuda. Running for president on the basis of nothing. Ted Cruz, perhaps even more inane. This week you saw him, right? He has to do several takes. Take one, take two, take three, take him away. This would be the end of the world, pretty much, I guess. Now we have the union buster, in many ways a neo-fascist, right? Right to work, union busting, killer austerity, and they call that a populist? A populist who busts unions? Isn't that rather odd? And some may consider him a bridge too far, but Chris Christie, the mafia view, I guess, of this entire thing. Is that the future you want? Or perhaps a wild card. Now, if you see, this is my test. If you're not laughing, you're not well informed. If you're well informed, you're laughing. Who is it? Joni Ernst. And why is she up here?
Because she walked to school.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So some people are well informed. The senator from Stepford. she gave the Republican response. And she said, when we were, my childhood, we were so poor that I only had one pair of good shoes to go to church, go to meeting shoes. Had to put bread bags on my feet to protect them from getting all wet in the snow and everything. So, you know, you name it, right? Stepford, I guess we'll do it. And the winner is, any guesses? President Xi. With that crowd, it's President Xi. Now, I have to clarify my attitude toward China. I'm an admirer of China. I'm a Sinophile. I lived in Taiwan for a couple of months. I'm very much in favor of China. I think everybody has to pay tribute to the 400 million people they've lifted out of poverty, thereabouts. And I want them to be strong enough to be a counterweight to the United States, just as I wish Russia to be strong enough to be counterweight to the United States. However, I don't want to be ruled by President Xi. President Xi is not a suitable ruler for the United States. And if you don't see this problem, you better look at it. I would quote the Italian economist Sapelli of Milan, who turned to a bunch of Italian leftists in a YouTube film, and he says, you know, you guys are always whining about U.S. world domination. I want to hear you when you've tried Chinese world domination for a while. You'll be singing a different tune, that it might actually be more difficult in some ways. Or maybe that's the winner. Because you can see how it would go, right? If you know your U.S. ruling class, and I try to, you can imagine constant U.S. decline. You may or may not know the Chinese have already passed the U.S. in two key measures of economic strength, of gross domestic product and so forth. We're going to get some kind of a moment of shock, perhaps when the Chinese astronaut gets to the moon or to Mars, mainly the moon. When the Chinese start a permanent base on the moon and the U.S. has nothing, there's going to be a freak out of this U.S. ruling class. And given their typical way of thinking, right, maybe they'll try military means to redress the balance, all they can think of, and they get into these silly little islands, and it turns out to be this. Don't let us get to this point. And what else could we say about him? He's, again, many positive features, but we're not doing this to cut the U.S. down so much that the balance is lost in the other direction. We're aiming at an approximate rough balance, right? We're talking about balance of power, realistic politics. And the problem is complicated because the Chinese have not solved the problem of governance, which we have solved here. Unless the libertarians destroy this government that we have, we've got the problem of internal governance pretty much solved. They have not. They are illegitimate, right? There's no voting. He's chosen by this clique and everything, oligarchy. And what he does, therefore, in order to maintain consensus, is this constant picking fights with Japan, picking fights with neighbors, picking fights with Vietnam, the Philippines, and all this other stuff. So there is an element of instability here that could conceivably resonate with the maniacal tendencies of the U.S. bankers and get us all into a terrible fix. So let's avoid it. Now there's the question. You want to sit back for the rest of your life and let those people rule? Or do you want to do something about it? And my favorite slogan, taught to me by a Spanish coal miner from the Asturias on the north coast of Spain. The problem for all of us, get active or get radioactive. So, world historical individuals are what we need. It's an invitation. This ruling class cannot go on. It's got to be reformed, renovated, replaced. And the old question, if not you, who? If not now, when? We're certainly hoping that out of this will come something of that nature. However, if you want to do it, you can't just, do this by winging it, right? You can't just do it from one day to the next. You've actually got to develop superiority to these decadent rulers, and it means you got to do some work. So if you've come here, I guess it's true. Now, here's what I recommend everybody do. I think this is the beginning of personal morality. I noticed that Republicans like William Bennett, he writes a book of virtues, and his book of virtues are all private virtues, right? Like don't beat your dog. I prefer public virtues, like don't support genocide, right? Don't support aggressive wars. So this is in the nature of the public virtues. The first step is, if you decide you want to go down this path, what is it, the red pill and the blue pill? Which is the one where you want to know what's what? The blue pill?
The red pill.
The red pill gets you to the truth, right? Okay, the red pill. You want to take the red pill, you have to survey the world crisis of our time, okay? And it's horrendous. We just did some of the main points. In the middle of all this, you've got to match up a critical point of intervention where something can be done. And I don't mean you can't go out and say, I'm going to destroy the Republican Party next week, because you can't do that. What you can do is to say something like, I'm going to provide that extra margin that gets General Allen indicted and Petraeus indicted. Right? I can just give that a little push, because it's already going. You can select points of intervention, like pressure points, right? Like a judo expert would do. Identify the most critical points of intervention, or point, and then look into yourself. What can you do? What are your abilities? What are you willing to do? Willing to take risks? Courageous? Genius? Intelligent? What do you have? Figure out how to match your strongest capability to some essential part at the center of the world problem. And then you must act. You must take vigorous, ruthless action. And you might say, what's in it for me? Right? Sounds like, a life of sacrificing myself for the benefit of others. In many ways it is. Except that out of that, you gain world historical identity. The Chinese might say, you want your name to be fragrant in 10,000 years? Do something. Now, genius. Hollywood purveys a concept of genius. We have Stephen Hawking, who talks about the Big Bang and the black holes. I have to tell you, I was shocked this afternoon. National Public Radio. It's Science Friday. Right? Ira Flatow? Anybody? No? He had Professor Penrose of Oxford talking about black holes and the Big Bang. And we'll get back to this tomorrow, because this is one of our points. Anyway, that Penrose is a great friend of Stephen Hawking. And they read about the black holes. I'll let you in on the secret that I believe the black holes, I think there is no such thing, or it cannot be proven, or it is epistemologically a blind alley, right? It's bankrupt. But anyway, they tell you Stephen Hawking is a genius. Alan Turing is now in a Hollywood movie, right? The guy who cracked or helped to crack the German Enigma code. And we have John F. Nash, The Beautiful Mind, right? Remember the beautiful mind of John Nash. And this is game theory. This is something that speculators can use. In particular, John F. Nash was officially, the state of New Jersey said that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, spent most of his time in mental institutions. As soon as you say genius, many people conclude that genius is inseparable from mental illness. This is still very much around. And the question, therefore, is insanity really necessary to be a genius? This is one of our questions we're going to try to answer. Maybe we can try to make some progress on this tonight. Now, our ideas of genius are different, right? Where we are here, it's Confucius, it's Plato, it's St. Augustine. St. Augustine, very interesting guy. If not black, very brown, happens to be the founder of our civilization, right? The separation of the Greco-Roman classical world with the collapse of the Roman Empire into the new world of Latin Christianity. He's the man. Dante, of course, Machiavelli. The beginnings of modern science are not in Francis Bacon, but Leonardo da Vinci. Leibniz is one of our main guys. He almost became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, and so forth. These people are geniuses sometimes in intellectual terms, right? Purely intellectual, but also as political organizers. I can show you, for example, that Dante was part of the foundation of the pilot project or prototype for the modern state. In Milan, the founding of the Visconti dynasty in 1310. Dante was there. Every one of them. We can go through it. Machiavelli was the political advisor to Cesare Borgia. And Cesare Borgia is not who cable television told you he is. He's quite different. But these are real geniuses. So, push ahead. We want to have a school for leaders. And we have to do this in an anti-authoritarian era, right? With the whole idea of a leader, right? All the postmodernists hate the idea. They're all freaking out, if we have any. Now, obviously, everybody has a moment. Well, maybe folly is too much, but certainly human weakness, right? When Dante is told at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, you're going to get to see everything. You're going to get to see the Inferno and Purgatory. He says, look, I'm not Aeneas. I'm not the founder of the Roman Empire. I'm not St. Paul, the founder of the church. Why me? Well, you've self-selected yourself, so I hope you continue. Now, this is maybe a little bit too complicated to do in complete detail, but when civilizations collapse, there are harbingers, and these, according to my thinking, are the harbingers of civilizational collapse as we've seen them at different times. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism in China, back here, 600 BC. This is a step down from the civilization that existed before. Diogenes the Cynic, right, living in the barrel and performing all bodily functions in the open marketplace. Similar. Catullus and Petronius in Rome, right? This is like the death of civilization through pornography. Al-Ghazali, the Sufi, is the negation of the high point of Islamic civilization. Right? You remember around 800 in Baghdad, you had this luminous renaissance around the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Now that was a caliph. That was a caliph we could all get behind, Harun al-Rashid. But that was 800, and indeed Harun al-Rashid is known for his good relations with Charlemagne, the king of the Franks. So east to west in 800 AD. William of Ockham, the stupidest philosopher of the Middle Ages, the founder of nominalism, is undoubtedly one of the forces that corroded and destroyed medieval European civilization. When we get to maybe the late 1600s, early or 1700s in general, the French Ancien Régime, this role of harbinger of collapse is taken over by something called the Cabal of the Libertines, and we're already closing in. Who were these libertines? Casanova was one of them. He was a kind of Venetian agent, certainly. He was officially on the payroll of the Council of Ten of Venice, so he was a Venetian agent. Or, if you know Mozart's Don Giovanni, there's the famous Viva la Libertà, Long Live Liberty scene, and that, I think, is Mozart's critique of these libertines, right, that these people are evil. And similarly, today, the libertarians, people like, well, recent and certainly influential today, von Hayek, von Mises. Both of these two were paid by David Rockefeller and later their doctrines promulgated by the Koch brothers. In particular, David Rockefeller, remember we've seen him before, he's so stupid, couldn't balance his own checkbook. So what did he do? He had to have somebody at the London School of Economics to write his papers for him. And it looks like that was von Hayek, his ghostwriter. And the Koch brothers, of course, with the Cato Institute. So one of the big polemics we have is the idea that libertarians, Ron Paul, Rand Paul, people like this, that these are positive in any way. They're not. They're completely negative. And that somehow we need to build bridges to them. Ralph Nader, whom I call Ralph Nadir, because he often comes in at a very low level, Ralph Nader has proposed some kind of unprincipled flesh pile of, I don't know what, progressive, leftist, but somehow libertarians also. This is absolutely crazy. There can be no common ground. Ron Paul ran for president. His program was called Restore America. This was a budget that he drew up, and he stood behind it. And he wanted to cut food stamps by 63%. He wanted to cut $1 trillion out of the federal budget in 1 year, and he wanted to cut food stamps by 62 to 63%. Now, the only question is, how many will that kill? And how can you have genocide tolerated in the United States? We know the Republican governors who have refused the Medicaid expansion have inflicted approximately 18,000 useless deaths simply by denying people this coverage, right? It's more than Iraq, right? You're getting up to Nuremberg magnitudes. In the case of Ron Paul, he wanted to essentially take the average meal on food stamps from $1.50 per person per meal to 50 cents per person per meal. So tortillas and beans. And as somebody says in that famous novel, a diet of tortillas and beans is slow death. It is. That's why he's called Pellagra Paul. Scurvy, pellagra, rickets, those will be his hallmarks. You just can't do this. I think you have to look back. If you can remember the normal world, few people can remember the normal world. The normal world means the world before 1963, more or less. Before the Kennedy assassination, before Vietnam. Anybody coming forward and say, I want to cut a key life or death social safety net by 2/3, there would be two answers. One would be Bellevue, Creedmoor, mental hospital, St. Anne's, whatever you want, right? The loony bin. Or, if you insist and you want to be taken seriously, then Nazi, go home. The great effect of Ron Paul has been to so degrade the public discourse that that stuff is now presentable, right? Salonfähig, right? You can bring this into the sitting room and not be immediately kicked out. Okay? So I'm told people still haven't been able to break this hypnotic spell of the Ron Paul camp and the Rand Paul camp and the radio, the libertarian radios and the libertarian offbeat TVs that are associated with these, right? And you got to break, because these are the sirens of your destruction, right? If you think that there's anything to this is very much on the wrong side of things, right? For your own integrity and for your own future, don't pay attention to that stuff, right? Their whole world, they're going off increasingly into the wild blue yonder of actual paranoia. All right, so here's again the idea. Austerity is genocide. It's that simple. The reactionaries want wage, tax, and budget austerity. Bad. However, the left liberal mushheads, who should be providing an opposition, they demand an energy austerity based on this ridiculous theory of anthropogenic global warming. I will argue tomorrow there is global warming to a significant extent, but it's a result of solar activity. It's a matter of the sunspot cycle, and it's got very little to do with emissions here on Earth. So, you should look at the Reserve Army of Wall Street. This, by the way, this is Syriza language. This is what Tsipras says. Tsipras says, don't tell me that Farage, Le Pen, Alternatives for Germany, Beppe Grillo, don't tell me that those people are allies. They are the Reserve Army of the bankers. So here we go. We've got this. This struck me so much I got it twice. The Mount Pelerin Society, which is the international umbrella group of these crazies, was backed at the founding by the CIA, William Buckley, Cato Institute by the Koch clan, and, important, the Paul dynasty, the Paul bearers, the Paul Tards, are indeed creatures of the southern jurisdiction of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The leprechaun. You know the leprechaun movies, that constant refrain, "Me gold! Me gold!" He said, "A friend with weed is a friend indeed, but a friend with gold is the best I'm told." That's the... And, of course, duplicitous. He was the champion of earmarks. What he would do is insert the earmark for Galveston, his district, insert the earmark in the dead of night, come back in the daytime and vote against the bill as it passed with Democratic votes. What a guy. And he fooled people. Now, the other side of it is the mushheads, the left liberal mushheads. They are Malthusian. We'll talk about Malthus if this is not clear, but this is the principal theoretician of overpopulation and indeed of pollution, I guess by extension, with the help of Ruskin. He's anti-science, anti-labor, anti-third world. So you get a left liberal mushhead, right? We have talked to left liberal mushheads. You're a leftist? What are you, progressive? You're anti-labor, anti-third world, and you're a leftist? How can that work? What is that? What does it mean? I'm for the penguins and the polar bears, right? I guess that's what it is. They're all under the influence of the late imperialist school of Zinn and Chomsky. Remember that the essence of being a liberal is you think there's no such thing as right and wrong. They believe in moral relativism. I will try at the end, maybe not tonight, but I'm going to try to do a metaphysical or ontological deduction of human rights out of the situation of mankind in the world. And again, they think that the bankers are better than the alternatives. Now, the other problem we have is the other directed personality. And we're going to have to attack this from several points of view. But here in the United States, there is a systematic defect of character that one shares, right? You might say, you often hear people say, well, the Greeks are lazy, or the English are phlegmatic, right? Or the Germans are dogmatic, or the French are God knows what. You've heard all these cliches. Well, our problem is this question of the other directed personality. And it goes back to this book, which you should at least take a look at.
I got it right
Huh?
here. It's right here.
Great. Pass it around if you want. The Lonely Crowd by David Reisman. Now, can we go? I think I'm a little bit out of order now. Can we just go back so I can choose where I take this up again? Because I'd like to handle this whole part on the other directed personality.
Like that?
No. You don't understand. I got to see. I got to get through. Here we go. Other American ideology. Let's see. And all right, fine. What we'll probably do is let's skip out of this. Let's go on with the mushheads. We have to do a big polemic against a number of the intellectual poobahs of the left liberal mushheads. And I'm sorry the late Howard Zinn gets into this category. Now, when I was a graduate student, I also learned that wearing a blue work shirt allowed you to pose as a friend of the masses. And I see that he's still doing this well into the new century. A smelly pipe was a useful prop, too. He calls himself an anarchist. And according to Michael Kazin, which I think is correct, he sees history as a Manichaean fable. This is a real destructive potential that we have with these left liberals. Howard Zinn, I say, his problem is he is opposed to civilization as such. He just doesn't like civilization. Tomorrow I'm going to show that in this he reflects the pervasive influence of Rousseau in today's world. But he doesn't like civilization. He doesn't like any government. He doesn't like any power system which is constituted. He supports any rebellion. Any rebellion is good. Any establishment is bad. Never likes governments. One of his problems in his critique of the U.S. is that he seems to be following Marx. If you want to write the history of the 19th century, you cannot maintain, in my view anyway, that the U.S. is the worst of all the actors on the world stage. No way. It's impossible. The British Empire eclipses the abuses and evil that were, of course, present in the United States. The question when you're attacking the U.S. in the way that he does is always compared to what, right? Compared to who? What else was there? What was the alternative, right? If you didn't like Abraham Lincoln, who were you going to get? Queen Victoria, Lord Palmerston, right? The British East India Company killing 10, 20, 30 million people in India. It's a terrible distortion. So the U.S. is always bad. The U.S. has a monopoly on evil. In the 19th century, this is absurd. Of course, what he's doing is taking the post-Kennedy assassination world and projecting that backwards. In other words, today you can argue, I think, much more that the U.S. is at least a principal center of evil on the world stage. Maybe not the principal center, but a one. But when you go back, the further you go back towards people like Roosevelt and indeed Lincoln, this no longer holds up. So in other words, what he's done is he's thrown out everything that was positive because he sees it as having been part of a chauvinistic narrative that enabled all of these terrible abuses. The other thing about it, of course, there are no heroes in postmodernist narrative. And there used to be no atheists in foxholes. For him, there are no heroes, right? Everybody's got to be dragged down. Everybody's venal and corrupt and loathsome and horrendous and so forth. So, important to get him out of the way. So we don't share that. What we're attempting to do is to refurbish the Renaissance concept of human greatness. Good concise expression from Shakespeare and Hamlet. What a piece of work is mankind. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. It's a kind of philosophical optimism, right? No postmodernist could accept this, right? They freak out. They're here to tell you that everybody is essentially bad. Now, let's see if we can continue here. Now, you may wonder, when does the economics start? This is not a course in something like business economics, right? This is not, the accounting and decision-making practices of executives in small and medium firms, right? This is going to be macroeconomics, right? Huge world scale, world economy, world division of labor. But here's the thing. This course traditionally has attempted to reflect the fact that before you get to the economics, you've got to deal with philosophy, world outlook, and even psychology. We'll show in a minute. Just about every economic school is based on a philosophical school. You'll see. And this leads us back to the Italian communist, I guess. Not much of a communist, but really an interesting person. This is Antonio Gramsci. And his thesis is, everybody is a philosopher. Everybody has a philosophical outlook. Especially the ones who say they don't. Right? People today in the United States say, what? Philosopher? What are you talking about? Me? No way. Epistemology? No, never happened. But every person is a philosopher in the sense of having some kind of perhaps unspoken sense of the way the world works, the way things fit together. And this is practical, and you can see it in behavior, even if people say the opposite. For example, just the one example, that guy Bennett that we seem to get back to, he's there to tell you college is not worth it. Mr. Bennett, where are your kids? Oh, they're in the Ivy League. Because he really has a philosophy that you need to go to college, despite what he says. The American ideology, and you have to face the fact, right? Be honest with yourself. Unless and until you have exited from these schools, you're probably in them. And that is to say, empiricism. That everything is based on sense impressions, and that that's how you know the world, right? That it all comes in through the senses, and you can rearrange that, but that's basically it. Oh, and with a typo, pragmatism. Pragmatism, which says it doesn't matter what is true. The only thing that matters is what works. And what's the cash value of your idea? Don't tell me your idea is beautiful or true. I want to know the cash value. And mixed in with that is this dose of conformity or other directedness. I'm still trying to find the link into that series of slides, which somehow got lost in the email. Other directedness or heterodirection. Let me see if I have this. Just bear with me for 1 second here. Where are we? Yeah, here we go. Let's do this. David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd. This is what's going around, right? The modern U.S. ideology is largely based on this. So, he's writing about 1950, and he's distinguishing two personality types. There are actually three, but in particular he focuses on two. One is the inner directed person. This is the stern moralist of the 19th century, right? Think of Abraham Lincoln, you won't go wrong. Maybe General Grant, somebody like this. The inner directed personality is guided by strong precepts of morality, which have been inculcated by parents, teachers, clergy, maybe coaches, sports. And these form a gyroscope. The inner directed person has a moral code, and again, the gyroscope is a very good example. The gyroscope, because it's always going to tell you which way is up, which is right, which is wrong. Understand that in comparison with the other directed. The other directed personality has no gyroscope. The other directed personality is always looking around to see which way the public opinion wind is blowing. What do people say? The other directed person is controlled by the shifting opinions of shifting peer groups. Right? Cliques. It's a cliquish personality. They want to know which way is the clique going on this one. And then they parrot that. Here they don't have a gyroscope. They have antenna. To pick up the impulses. Should I buy this product? Yes, go on it. It's popular. How about this one over here? No, it's not popular. Oh, in that case. So, the shifting opinions of shifting peer groups. Now, this is the difference. Somebody with a gyroscope, somebody with antenna. You got to think about this, right? In our business, you're not going to make it with the antenna. You better get the gyroscope installed. Right? In other words, you've got to understand yourself a purpose in life, what you must do, your responsibility. Now, there's also the tradition-directed. The tradition-directed are the peasants, and they do the same thing year after year, right? And it's always in Proverbs. proverbs that maybe rhyme, right? It's really the peasants, you really don't have them in the U.S., you could argue it, but in other parts of the world there are still peasant societies. Now, the thing that I would argue, let me see if I have this, that I did argue it. I did argue it. Look, here we are in the spring of 1959, and we had an assembly. Our principal, Dr. Gastworth, in junior high school 185 Queens, Flushing, he said, let's get some kids together and talk about the problem of conformity here, right? The McCarthy witch hunt was dying down. It was the late Eisenhower era. There was a certain opening, right? The Democrats had won the 1958 House election. So we actually had an assembly addressed by two other guys, and I'm trying to remember their names overnight, but I can't, and yours truly, on the problem of the conformist culture of the United States and why this was bad. I've felt this for a long time. And one of the things also you got to bear in mind that we have in recent is ostracism. You know, ostracism? It's in Athens they would have a court. A court was a mob, anybody who came in. And they'd say, such and such a person is getting uppity. He has too much power. What do you think? Should we exile him? Should we kill him? Should we put him in jail? And they'd break up old pots, and you'd write the verdict on the piece of old pottery, and you'd toss that in. And those were the ostra. So ostracism was common, right? Busting people to enforce conformity. In other words, don't get your head up too high, or you're going to get it chopped off. You can argue that under Truman and under McCarthy, the anti-communist witch hunt broke the American spirit. And the relics of this are the silent generation, right? Let's not forget about them. They're born about, 1925 or so, or 1920 to 1945. And they grew up under the shadow of the McCarthyite witch hunt. And they're very meek in some ways. This is the generation that has not produced a president, at least so far, and it doesn't look like they will. Right? There's been no silent generation president so far. The one who came closest was Mondale, and maybe there you see what the problem is. So my contention is we are dealing with an eclipse of the human personality. Now, I would also say that Reisman, this was a how-to book. In other words, he's writing at Harvard to say, how can we break the spirit of the American people and make them into passive, docile objects of our rule, right? How can we do that internally? How do we smash their gyroscope? If their gyroscope leads them to rebel, we can't have that. We're going to replace the gyroscope with the antenna. Why has it gotten worse? Well, the antennae are now more developed. In other words, it used to be, no matter how much of a schlemiel, other-directed person you were, you could go to your room, you could go walk in the woods, but not anymore. Right now, we've got the artifacts. Right? What should I do? My peer group is calling. Wait a minute, maybe I'm making a terrible mistake. Right? You get the idea. So the problem of other-directedness has become worse. It's worse. The millennials are bombarded with peer group signals 24/7 in the antenna. They have no peace, right? They never stop receiving these things. So this was the idea. Why, please, turn off the instant messages, right? Because it undermines your attention span, and it also leads to kind of, gossip, backbiting. Remember that for the other-directed people, the peer group discipline is enforced by gossip, right? By undercutting you, right? Slander. And that has become more pervasive now that it's always on the instant messages. So this whole social media thing has tremendously increased the passivity, and this is a problem for us. We want to organize people for political action, but wherever you go, they're paralyzed, right? We had one observer tell us, the millennials, right? Let's look at some of the most passive. I don't want to pick on them. Here, let's start with the others, the so-called baby boom, right? The post-war generation were pounded. We had the Cold War, assassinations, Vietnam, Watergate. The Great U-turn refers to the fact that the U.S. standard of living starts to decline. Between 1967 and 1974, it starts to go down. The whole history of the U.S. had been a rise in the standard of living, but between Nixon and Ford starts to go down. So the curse of the post-war generation has been that they've been subjected to a declining standard of living. The mushheads, sorry, I didn't mean it. It must have been a Freudian moment, but the postmodern paradigm shift, of course, has to do with this and the Vietnam War. So, again, who has seen a normal society? The question for the post-war people is, have you learned anything out of all this, right, after being pounded? They used to be called the me generation, Well, that didn't turn out so well, did it? Let's see if we can do another one. Generation X, so-called. Now, I also point out, nobody is compelled to do any of this. You have free will. That's what I'm appealing to. I'm not telling you this stuff so you wallow in it. I'm telling you, break out of it, and you can. The curse of Generation X is they have only lived in a low-wage economy. The social safety net was shredded after 1968 by Nixon, by Reagan, by Carter, and others. People had a hell of a time getting through college. A lot of these people are bitter and resentful. They have been the most reliable support. I guess I'm getting into the typo area. The most reliable support for the Gulf War, the Afghan War, and the Iraq Wars, Generation X. They are the warmongers. And they've seen the union busting escalating since the time of Reagan and the air traffic controllers. Well, let's see. Here we go, the millennials. I guess we're up to the millennials now. Now, the notion of a normal world has been lost. Right? The baby boomers had seen it. The Xers had remembered something about it. Now it's gone. And these poor denizens have been duped by Obama in 2008, duped by Occupy in 2011. They have been crushed by the 2008 depression, victims of these omnipresent social media, therefore obsessed by the interpersonal relations as reflected in the social media, and as one very judicious observer has pointed out, oscillating between apathy or passivity on the one hand and being offended on the other. But what I would say to you is, if you happen to find yourself in a generational cohort where leaders are hard to find, take advantage. You become a leader. You take over and provide the leadership that they can't provide. And I'm quite serious. Look at it as an opportunity. Let's just see if we've got it now. And that's the U.S. cultural predicament now. This is now among the most passive in human history. I don't know. And it also has to do with the purely economic side, right? If you're crushed by student loans, you can't get a job, you can't get your own home, no independent life, no marriage, no experience of parenting, right? This is pushing you back away from another, various series of opportunities. Whoop. Now let's see where we go from here. So look, the finding from our original, the picture series that we went through at the beginning. The U.S. British banking oligarchy and its minions are intellectually bankrupt. I must say, I figured this out by about 1967. I actually thought if you kowtow to somebody like Kissinger, then you're going to become stupid like he is. So you can't do that. You can't go to work in the State Department or anything of the sort because it's going to leave you in that terrible predicament. So, we need to acquire a method to develop our economics. That is to say, a way of thinking. It cannot be empiricism and pragmatism, because we know that those are the ones that have led this civilization into the current crisis. So what I would suggest is a detour that will get us to a much better vantage point to seek the basis of a philosophical method in psychology. Now, I actually think that it's better to break off now. What have we got? 9 o'clock. Let me just see if there's anything back here. Whoop. You'll see some of my choice stuff that's waiting for tomorrow. Here, this is the idea. The reason we have to do the philosophical detour, and even into psychology, is that economic schools are based on philosophical schools. It really is true. If you look at the principal enemy school, the Ricardo, Malthus, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, those people were all employees or associates of the British East India Company, right? Ricardo was on the board of directors. Malthus ran the cadre school. James Mill was he'd do all the correspondence with India. John Stuart Mill was also a top official. Whatever you have heard about classical British economics, it all comes out of the British East India Company. And who did we mentioned before? They are the ones who brought you genocide in India and China through the 3 opium wars. They destroyed the economy of India with tens of millions of deaths and famines and so forth, and they sent all that opium to China, which destroyed the society. Right? The resentment of China against the West goes back to the fact that there were these 3 opium wars, and the British waged war to force opium down the throats of the Chinese, destroys the minds of these people, and so forth. And when you look at libertarianism, this is also based on a philosophical school, right? Anybody heard of Ernst Mach? No? Oh, he was a big, important guy in the 19th century. Anyway, that's what libertarianism is based on, a philosophical school. And we should do that attack tomorrow. Now, let's see if we have any else thing we can throw in. Now, I think I've done the job on the American ideology for tonight. Of course, there are other ideologies, right? There's a lot of fun. Now you get to laugh, right? The French is based on the formalism of René Descartes, right? And it's a straitjacket. It doesn't work well. The German one is based primarily on the philosopher Immanuel Kant, or Kant, because he couldn't. Is a theory that mental operations, depending on pure reason, are impossible. Thoroughness, right? If you know the Blue Angel with Emil Janning, and you've got to have the pen pointing exactly in the right direction. Right? In other words, everything's got to be lined up perfectly. That's Kant. The British, we're going to see more and more, based on the extreme sensationalism of Locke. You know, sensationalism, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that he has dirty pictures in the philosophy books. What sensationalism means here is that everything in your mind is based on your sensations. And, of course, it's not true. And there's a Russian one, right, which is maybe more complex, but it has strong elements of melancholy and a certain dash of irrationalism thrown in, right? So everybody's got problems, right? We want to focus on the American one, but this is all over the place. And someday somebody will come up with a compendium on where every principal national ideology gets it wrong. And I would point out, if you know somebody like Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of modern China, one of the things he did, which is parallel to the method that I try to follow, Sun Yat-sen said, you've got to polemicize against the Chinese Mandarin ideology. You've got to do a direct attack and say, here's where you guys get it wrong. We don't have time tonight, but he has a number of points. He has, for example, he says, the Mandarin thinks that practice is hard and knowledge is easy. And Sun Yat-sen says this is the reverse of the reality. Sun Yat-sen says, practice is easy. It's easy to build a building compared to explaining all the physical properties and processes that go into it. Practice is easy, knowledge is hard. The Mandarin ideology says practice of doing things is hard, but knowledge is easy, and therefore you have contempt for knowledge, and then you don't go anywhere. So that's a polemic from, we could have added that to this, right? That Dr. Sun Yat-sen is aware of a Chinese ideology. So I suggest now what we've got to do is to continue tomorrow based on, there's the Mach and Menger. We'll do that tomorrow. There's Ayn Rand. She's been there again and again. We have to now proceed to psychology. So if people have that book by Lawrence S. Kuby, ooh boy, my typing is getting bad, huh? In the days before psychology was replaced by psychopharmaca, we had people who actually tried to theorize what allowed creativity, what allowed genius, how could this be developed, and how could you do it? And this was a distinguished psychoanalyst who practiced in New York, but at the end of his career, he came to Maryland. He came to the Enoch Pratt Hospital in or near Baltimore and ended his career. And what we're going to see, this is just now a hint of what's coming for next week. We're going to have to delve into the interplay of the conscious mental processes, the unconscious mental processes, right? In other words, to say the ego and the id, but we're going to add the element that everybody else seems to have forgotten. And the great merit of Kuby is that he says we want to also focus on the pre-conscious processes linked to the superego, which he argues, and I believe, and I have lived by, this is the seat of creativity. Okay? And he's the one viable strain of thought coming out of Freudianism, which of course now has collapsed in the meantime. So if you have that book, Neurotic Distortion of the Creative Process by Lawrence S. Kuby, M.D., we will start with that tomorrow, and we will see how that allows us then to rebuild a psychological approach. And then tomorrow afternoon, we get down to the economics. Okay? And there we are at 9 o'clock. Thank you.